Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum everybody. My name is Abdullah Salim al-Hiwaji. I would like to welcome you back after a long pause to my principles of pharmacology. In this session, inshallah, we'll start talking about drug treatment of mental disorders, and this presentation will talk about the different types and the causes of mental disorders. Why we should know the types and the mechanisms? Because each type of the mental disorder will respond to different groups of drugs, and we have to know the mechanisms involved in order to understand the mechanisms of action of drugs. So the main objectives of this presentation is to know what are the different types and subtypes of mental disorders, including psychosis and neurosis. Inshallah, we will know about the causes of mental disorders and their mechanisms, whether they are genetic, psychological, or environmental factors. First, we have to know what we mean by mental disorder. Usually, the definition given by the WHO, which is the World Health Organization, they defined a mental disorder as a disturbance in either individual cognition or in the emotional regulation of the person or behavioral disturbances. So any disturbance in each of these or all of them is considered to be a mental disorder. So what are the different classes of mental disorders? Mental disorders generally classified into two major classes. The first is known as psychosis, and the second is known as neurosis. Psychosis, neurosis. How they differ from each other? They differ first in their effect on the personality of the person. Where usually in psychosis the personality of the person is affected. There is a change in the personality of the person. While personality of the person in neurosis is normal, is not changed. The person feels that he is normal and looks normal. A second difference in the contact with the reality. Contact with the reality. Usually in psychosis, the contact with reality is usually lost. The person lives in his own world. يعني contact with reality is lost. Where in neurosis usually the contact with reality الارتباط بالواقع. Usually it is normal, and the person he lives in a normal reality. Okay. A third difference in the hallucination and delusion, which is a feature of psychosis. Usually the hallucination and halwasa with delusion الأوهام usually they are present in cases of psychotic illnesses, while they are absent in neurosis. Usually they are absent. In very rare cases they might be present. Okay. A fourth difference in the causes, where usually psychosis is genetically caused by genetic defects or biochemical defects. Also, environmental factor is involved in psychosis. In neurosis usually it is psychological. It is caused by life stresses usually. ولكن biological or genetic factors that are also involved in some types of neurosis. Lastly, in the different treatment, where psychosis usually needs drug. They are treated with antipsychotic drugs. They are treated with antipsychotic medication. Also, psychological therapy will help, and social support. Neurosis, on the other hand, usually it is treated by psychological therapy, and sometimes if psychological therapy is not effective, drugs are available for treatment of neurotic illness. So this is the major classification of mental disorder into psychosis and neurosis. So now we'll talk about the different types of neurotic illnesses, different types of neurosis. The very first type, which is well known, is known as generalized anxiety disorder. Generalized anxiety disorder, which is known in abbreviation as the GAD disorder, GAD disorder, GAD disorder. Usually, an anxiety or GAD disorder, usually it's a condition of excessive worry and feeling of agitation. Usually the person who feels anxiety, he feels excessive worry, restlessness, irritability, and insomnia. Usually generalized anxiety can be treated by psychological therapy, and drugs also are available. The second type is known as depression. Depression usually it involves a person mood اللي هو يسموه المزاج. Usually the mood is low. It produces severe stress. It produces sadness without any underlying cause. Okay. Depression, the opposite of depression is known as mania, which is usually is an elevated mood. Although some people they don't classify depression and mania as a type of neurosis. They call it affective psychosis. Affective psychosis. Affective means it will affect the mood of the person. It will affect the mood of the person. Affective psychosis. Okay. The third type is known as obsessive compulsive disorder. Obsessive compulsive disorder. It is either composed of obsession with thoughts, impulses, or images, and or compulsion. Compulsion usually it means repetitive behavior. Like for example, in hand washing. The patient or the person might be afraid of infection, usually he washes his hands many times a day. This is known as compulsive behavior. Like for example, checking whether the doors of the house is closed or not, and so on. Okay, so this is the third type of neurotic illnesses. Fourth type is known as phobia or social phobia. Social phobia is the fear of certain things, like for example, the fear of heights. That is known as acrophobia. Fear of heights, acrophobia. Or fear of flying. That's known as aerophobia. Or fear of water, like aquaphobia. فمثلا في بعض الناس ما يحبوش البحر والسباحة بالبحر لأن they have aquaphobia وهكذا. This is known as phobia. Some people they suffer from social phobia اللي هو الخوف الرهاب الاجتماعي. Next is the post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder, which is usually abbreviated as PTSD. This is very common, especially when the person is exposed to shocking or dangerous situation, like في حالة الوars. The person usually he will suffer from certain symptoms like fear, like vivid dreams with flashbacks, etc. Yet this is known as post-traumatic stress disorder, and this is very common in most people when exposed to shocking or dangerous events. Last is panic disorder. Well, panic disorder is sudden attack of fear. Usually it is involved after exposure to stresses, persistent stresses, and these will lead to certain symptoms like increased heart rate, like irritability, like fear, like worry, etc. يعني it resembles anxiety, except that anxiety stays for a very long period of time. When panic attack, it only involves a few hours and then disappears. So these are the different types of neurotic illness. Second is the different types of psychotic illness or psychosis. The very first known psychotic disorder is known as schizophrenia or schizophrenia. The main features or the main symptoms are the hallucinations and delusions together. Yeah, the person will see things or will hear things which are not present, and usually he suffers from delusions like delusion of persecution or delusion of being followed or being plotted against, and etc. Yeah, but these are the symptoms of schizophrenia, which is usually should continue for at least more than 6 months. The second type is known as schizoaffective disorder. Schizoaffective disorder. This will be involving hallucination, delusion, plus mood disturbances, plus disturbances in the mood. في المود schizoaffective. Affective relates to mood. There are symptoms of hallucination and delusions plus mood disturbances, either mania or depression. Either mania or depression. This is known as schizoaffective disorder. Third is known as schizophreniform disorder. Schizophreniform. This means that it is like schizophrenia, hallucination plus delusions, ولكن for a very short period of time. يعني it is less than 1 month. يعني hallucination will continue for less than 1 month وبعدين disappears. Okay. عكس proper schizophrenia. Usually في proper schizophrenia this hallucination and delusion will continue for more than 6 months. Third, next is the brief psychotic disorder. وجاي من اسمها brief psychotic disorder. Usually the person suffers from hallucination and delusions when exposed to external trigger. External trigger. Yeah, I mean, some people, when they are exposed to certain stress in life, like a death of loved person or whatever, this person will suffer from hallucination and delusions for a short period of time, usually less than a month. Okay, you have the brief psychotic disorder. Usually it is triggered by certain stresses like a death of a person, etc. Lastly is delusional disorders. Delusional disorders. With delusionals, usually there is no hallucination. The person lives in reality. ولكن he suffer from different types of delusions. For example, he will be under delusion of being followed or being plotted against or having a certain disease. يعني مثلا الناس كل ما تشوف واحد مريض بالسرطان يقول حتى أنا مريض بالسرطان، ولا واحد عنده كل beliefs delusions false feeling and beliefs. They are not true beliefs. هذه يسموهم delusional disorders. Okay, but these are the different types of psychosis. Schizophrenia, which in person suffers from hallucination and delusion for a long period of time. It might be accompanied by mood disorders. الحالة هذه يسموها schizoaffective. It might happen due to for a short period of time, for less than 1 month, or it might happen after exposure to certain triggers like stress. It might happen only with delusions without hallucinations. But these are the different types of psychotic illness. So what are the main causes of mental disorders? There are 3 main causes. Either there might be biological, which involves the genes of the person. It might be psychological factor or environmental. We'll talk first about the biological factors. Usually biological involves defect in the neurochemistry of the brain, defect in neurotransmitters in the brain. How they know that? How they know that there is a defect in the chemistry of the brain? They found that schizophrenia usually is treated by antipsychotic drugs, and these antipsychotic drugs block dopaminergic receptors or serotonergic receptors. So you have the schizophrenia is due to defects in the dopaminergic معناها dopamine neurotransmission, or serotonergic معناها serotonin neurotransmission. Also they found that depression can be treated by antidepressant drugs, and these antidepressant drugs they act through the noradrenergic and the serotonergic system. فقالوا يبقى it is logic to think that depression is due to disturbance in the adrenergic or serotonergic activity. Also, they found that in GAD or general anxiety, they are treated with drugs which increase GABAergic activity, GABAergic and serotonergic activity. فبالحالة هذه قالوا therefore in an anxiety can be caused by a defect in the GABAergic or serotonergic activity. These are biological factors. These are biological factors. These disturbances can happen due to genetic factors. They are known as genetic defects. يعني a person is born with these defects. يعني it is genetic. يعني genes which are causing these illnesses, they are يعني malfunctioning. They are malfunctioning. ما دام it is genetic defects يعني من خلق الله the person is not exposed to any other reason, يبقى في الحالة هذه it is heredity usually. Heredity يعني it can be transferred from one generation to the next generation. You have the genetic defects is the genetic defects in the neurochemistry of the brain. All the defects in the neurochemistry of the brain can be produced by brain injury, by brain injury. Like when it happens during birth or prenatal damage, or due to exposure to certain infection, whether it is viral or bacterial infection. Also, the abuse of certain drugs and the substance abuse of certain drugs can lead to psychological disturbances. Okay, this is the first major factor, which is biological, which is a defect in neurochemistry of the brain, and this defect usually can be either genetic or it can be a result as a defect or injury to the brain due to prenatal damage, exposure to certain infection, or drug abuse. The second factor is the psychological factors. For example, when the child is exposed to childhood trauma, like for example loss of parents, or physical trauma, or sexual abuse, if the childhood trauma can result in adulthood in psychological disorder. The second psychological factor is the neglection during childhood, and the child is not getting enough care from his parents. This will result in certain disorders when the child becomes adult. Also, a poor relationship with others, poor relationships. The child is exposed to several trauma due to his friends or whatever. This will result in psychological disturbances at adulthood. The last factor is the environmental factor. Usually these are triggers, they are stressors. They trigger certain psychological disorder like a panic attack, like an anxiety, like a hallucination. They are known as environmental factors. For example, the death of a relative or a loved person, or when the person is exposed to a divorce, dysfunctional family life, when the family life is bad due to family struggle, this might lead to psychological disturbances. The feeling of inadequacy, a person feels inadequate, low self-esteem, exposure to long-term anxiety, anger, loneliness, all these can trigger psychological disturbances. Changing jobs, also changing of schools in childhood can expose the person to psychological disturbances. Social culture will affect psychological state of the person. When the person is exposed, is supposed to be a thing, and it turns out to be a different thing. For example, in the society thinks beauty is a thinness, ان الواحد الضعيف هو اللي جميل، ويعتبروا ان obesity is a disorder. These can be the psychological disturbances. These are the different causes or which can cause psychological disorders. In summary, I can say we talked about the mental illnesses which involves disturbance in cognition, in behavior, and or emotional regulation. There are two major types, اللي هما neurosis and psychosis. We classified the neurosis and psychosis and what are the differences between these two major illnesses. We talked about the causes, whether they are biological, psychological, or environmental. I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I will say at the end, لله الحمد من قبل ومن بعد. In our next presentation, inshallah, we'll talk about drug treatment of neurosis. Thank you very much. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. شكرا لكم على حسن الاستماع. الرجاء لا تنسوا الاشتراك في القناة، الإعجاب، التعليق والمشاركة مع الزملاء. دمتم بخير وعافية، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.